Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Deborah. Thank you, B&H. Thank you, David. I'm happy to be here. It's fun for me to be back in New York, where I grew up, but I have not been much in recent years. So this is interesting. Sometimes I feel like a stranger in a strange land here. The topic of today's talk is digital black and white. Interestingly, or perhaps not interestingly, black and white is really color, in that the recommendation is to produce color files. And we'll talk more about that as I go along in my talk. The other thing that's interesting is up to a certain point in history, perhaps the mid-1940s or early 1950s, black and white was essentially the only way to go. Of course, then you got Kodachrome and color film, and now you have digital. So the choice to present an image in black and white as a monochromatic image, which is probably a preferable term to black and white, really, is a intentional presentation of an image in a way that is inherently artificial. And that's got pluses and minuses. I think for the right image, very, very big pluses. But you should think about this as a decision that is made intentionally to present something in a way that it isn't seen normally as part of vision. That's an effect and a plus that you don't get with a color photo. This is a message from my sponsor, the book that I have out. It's up here it can be bought and signed. And I do have a number of other books out. My most recent one before this was called Achieving Your Potential as a Photographer. And here are some of my other books going back in time. I've been translated into about 20 languages. Here's the Spanish version of one of my books. And here's contact information for me. I like to answer emails about photography, so there it is. So let's talk first about what the monochromatic vision is. Why did I pick the word monochromatic rather than black and white? Well, as I said, these are color files, and the mixture of blacks that are in these may not be entirely black, and probably usually isn't. What makes a black and white image special, like this Russian antique workbench here, is a graphical quality. Without the presence of color, you focus more on compositional issues, on contrast and light. When I process an image like this, specifically this image, I intend to get a look that is almost more like an etching than a photograph. So one thing to keep in mind is that the kinds of looks that you can get vary a lot depending upon what your final vision is. This is a monochromatic HDR image of agave leaves, and where it's been printed to a great deal of effect is on metallic silver paper, like the Moab Slick Rock Silver. And so again, I processed this one to look more like an etching than a photo. Just talking about agaves makes me thirsty. I call this image the road less traveled. It's at the footsteps of the Green Dragon Zen Monastery in the Marin Headlands near where I live in California. And you know, it's two roads, and there's a fork in the woods on a foggy day. But I also have this as a case study later on in this presentation, so you can see the original color raw file as unprocessed, how I processed it to color, and then how I processed it to black and white. That will come up later in this presentation. Part of the point here is that if you know you're going to go to black and white in the end, then you may want to exaggerate the process for color so that you have more tools to work with when you do the black and white conversion. This is a Yosemite Valley from tunnel view in the winter, and it's a gold-plated footstep image, you know. Ansel Adams was there first. Now it's sort of flattering. I've had people say to me, well, Harold, where exactly did you take a certain photo? We want to find your gold-plated footprints, but I'm not quite at the Ansel Adams stature yet. This is looking up in Antelope Canyon near Page, Arizona. And I use this image mostly as a teaching tool to say, just because you have all the information you want in an image, it does not mean you should show it. This was a 7-exposure HDR blend using a fisheye lens to get this ribbon of light. When I first processed the 7 images together, I saw every detail down here and up here in the black areas. And I made an intentional call not to show it because I thought the image was so much more dramatic as a ribbon of light across the frame rather than as something where all the details were obvious. This is the famous Bixby Bridge along Highway 1 in the coast of California, and it's about a 30-second exposure at night on a foggy night. It's kind of a gold-plated footstep image. There have been a lot of people doing that since I was there. And reflections in the water in a pond up in Maine. I teach every summer at the Maine Media Workshops, which is a really fun place to go if you're thinking about such things. The Piazza San Marco in Venezia. So what I often find is that you can get good black and white images at times and places where color would not work. There was no color here. One of the things to look for when you're thinking in black and white is there no color anyhow? And if there's no color anyhow, it's a good sign that you might want to go black and white. Why was there no color anyhow? Well, there was no color anyhow because it was dark and night and foggy. This is a sort of general paradigm I use for thinking about how to pre-visualize images, but it perhaps works better on black and white imagery than other kinds of imagery. Basically, the idea here is that it's great to walk along and say, hey, I have an idea for an image, or maybe in my case, sometimes even a client will come to me and say, we need this kind of thing. So you're thinking about something and you plan how to put it and you create it and you see what you got and then you go back and see whether you got the right thing and do it again. And this is a process that should be both in the camera, you look in your LCD screen and see, hey, did I get what I wanted? No, let me do it again. And then sort of in the long run as a lifestyle kind of thing as well. The sun was setting behind this barn door, casting these shadows here. So one tell that something is going to be a good monochromatic subject is strong shadows. If you see strong shadows, think monochrome. Here's another thing. You know, the common wisdom is that you can photograph at blue hour of dawn or sunset hour, blue hour after sunset or sunset hour, and as photographers of landscape, we may as well go to sleep in the middle of the day. Well, if you're black and white, that isn't true. So, another reason to think black and white. This is the Capitolio Nacional in Havana, lying on the floor with a fisheye lens. Anybody? Well, this is an egg yolk strainer. So again, it's a single light setup and strong shadow, and the point of the image is the shadow, really. And it's easy to do this kind of image. All you need is a single strong continuous light. Some more of the same kinds of things. I have a thing about eggs, egg slicer. I was recently asked for a photo magazine to explain how I made this image and how I processed it from color to black and white. And it's been pretty widely reproduced. It's a nautilus shell. Anyone can photograph a nautilus shell. Why my nautilus shell? There's something about this particular nautilus shell that has appealed to a fair number of art directors and so on. And the prints of it have sold well too. It turned out, when I looked back in my archives to see how I'd made it, what I actually had done is shot this on a light box on a white background. So the processing of this image involved converting it, and that's part of what gives the glow in this area. So proves that things aren't always what they seem. You know, this is a more conventional, it's still a nice image, but it's a more conventional nautilus shot with one of the great Zeiss lenses that I use for this kind of thing. And it has a pearly look to it, but it doesn't have the light coming through it. So one of the things that can work very well in black and white is backlighting. And if you're going to do Ansel Adams gold-plated footsteps, why not Edward Weston Pepper's too? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the technical aspects of black and white photography, or really photography in general. I'm someone with a background both in old-fashioned painting, hi Adrian, and also technical in software. And so in some ways, when digital photography came of age, it was perfect for me, because there's really a blend of it. A digital camera is a computer with a scanner at one end and a lens at the other. And the computer is the key part of it. So this is a diagram from my new book, from the photographer's black and white handbook. And it shows some of what you have to do if you get serious about this to keep your archives in sane state. It's a content management system diagram overview. I have about 100 terabytes of data at this point. And you know, that simply takes some IT management skills to deal with, to answer licensing requests for things that are 10 years old and so on. So that's part of what I deal with. It's a truism that if you're a professional photographer, a relatively small percentage of the time you spend is actually spent doing creative things. If I had to break it out, maybe 20% of my time is really sort of free creative, and the rest is, you know, doing business, writing licenses, doing IT management. I consider Photoshop creative, though, so maybe it's more than 20%. This is another diagram from the photographer's black and white handbook, and it shows basically the optimal black and white workflow. And leaving aside these things and this, which are possible but lead to less good results, you start with a raw capture, you process it in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, or you combine multiple exposures for an HDR blend. You convert to black and white using a layer stack and a variety of plugins, and we'll get to a bit more to that later. This is a quality versus effort graph. And the basic point is no pain, no gain. So you can easily turn most of your cameras to produce a black and white JPEG, but that's not going to have the subtlety and of tone, contrast, and everything else that you'll get if you do a best practices raw black and white conversion. So an image like this is an example of why you want to do that, because you need to have differentiation between how the relatively dark foreground is processed and the very bright, high contrast white of the waterfall. So the series of images here are all images that were created from somewhere between 5 and 10 bracketed sequence raw shots, which is what I typically do. This is a railroad bridge in rural Maine. There's another interesting point about this one, namely that at the pixel level, and no way you're going to see it from here, I put my face in.
You and Alfred Hitchcock.
A storm off the coast of Maine on Mohegan Island. And so one of the great things in this kind of photography is to render water as this long, flowing, wonderful, soft thing. And coming back to the theme that shadows make great black and white, you look at this image and you say this could be folds of a countryside, which is what it is. These are 1,000-foot cliffs down in the Panamint Range near Death Valley, or it could be almost a macro photo. Sense of scale is a great thing to play with. This is a place called The Wave in the Great American West, and it's a fairly vast space. So this is an example of a high key black and white image. The words high key and low key are thrown around a lot. High key essentially means an image that consists of mostly bright light tones. Low key is a dark image that consists of dark tones. In black and white, you can create and render great images that look okay, even though if you had shown them in color, they would look either blown out or mostly too dark. This is a fairly widely reproduced image of mine, and I've made some really big prints of it. One thing that is interesting is if you look carefully at it, you can see that the freighter back here has its lights on. So that's a giveaway that this image is not quite what it seems. It was shot at about midnight under a full moon. So your camera doesn't know whether it's day or night. Your camera reads the light, and if you set it right, it will compensate for low light, and it can make something that's actually a nighttime scene look like day. But to make the exposure here, I had to have a long enough exposure that it made this wonderful softening of everything except the island. It looks pretty exotic, but actually it's San Francisco Bay, which is kind of exotic. As an ex-New Yorker, I'm so happy to live in a place that's so beautiful. No offense, no offense. This is an old wooden pier off Cayucas, California, and again, it's the long exposure with the nice soft water. I shot this earlier. I guess about a year ago now, on the Oregon coast in Astoria, and it's a WPA, a 1930s bridge over the big bay there. And as I shot and processed it, my idea from the very beginning was to create a panorama, a multi-piece spliced panorama that got brighter and brighter and brighter as the bridge went off to the horizon over here. And going from the light side to the dark side, here's a night image of a fishing shack, and a very dark image of the sun setting behind Bixby Bridge on the Big Sur coast. A trick here is that if you want to get these rays out of a light source like the sun, what you do is you stop your lens down, depending upon the diaphragm of the lens in question, to f16 or f22, and that makes your diamond. And this is the Bay Bridge from the waterfront in San Francisco, and I captured and timed it so that the moon was right in the middle of the pillars of the bridge. Yeah, in California, we have the safety pin has become an icon these days. It says to all our friends and family who are friends and neighbors who are immigrants, you're safe with us. So it's a sanctuary city symbol. Yes, in color, this image of Fairy Falls in the Columbia River Gorge basically looks a little cliched, but in black and white, there's a wonderful sense of light coming down. Remember, as a matter of physics, you cannot actually photograph an object in this world. It isn't possible. The only thing you can photograph is the light reflected or emitted by an object. So that's an important insight, because as photographers, what we have to do is keep our eye on the light. The light is the only thing that matters, Luke. This is a stand of aspen near Sonora Pass in California. And interestingly, there's a pretty high dynamic range in this image between the dark of the forest and the light of the trees. So to capture the details in this, it requires multiple exposures. You can't do it with a single exposure. And if you look at this image, you can see the layer mask I painted to paint in the details of the trees, which otherwise would have been blown out on an average exposure. One thing is, never trust the light meter in your camera. Another way to put that is, you are smarter than your camera. These cameras are pretty damn smart, okay? The truth is, these days, if you put it on automatic and let it autofocus and so on, you're mostly going to get reasonably good photos, most of the time. But you are smarter than it is, and if you want to take your image that next step up and really make it striking, you've got to understand the basics of exposure and, when necessary, override your camera, because it doesn't know what is interesting in your image, and you do. I like this guy who is the father of 4 kids, as am I, and what he did was he tattooed each of his kids' faces on his body, which is what you see here. It's a studio strobe shot. The thing that, well, you know, for me, I remember when my kids were in preschool, I remember talking to the preschool, and they said, hey, for us, your kids are always 3 years old. Well, of course, they're not always 3 for parents who watch their kids grow up and do whatever they do. So it's a funny thing. His kids are always the age he has tattooed on his body. This is, speaking of kids always being an age, that's my daughter, my youngest daughter, Katie Rose there, and her mom. So portraits in black and white can create an opportunity to actually focus on the face of someone in a way that, or the character and personality in a way that can be harder when you're distracted with the color around them. So this is an iPhone shot, processed on the iPhone in somewhere in the southwest of France, actually. I have so much fun with my iPhone. I leave all the troubles and travails of the tripod and the 25-pound pack and everything else behind. My rule for myself with the iPhone is to process it on the iPhone. You know, you don't have to. You could pull it into Photoshop perfectly well, but I don't do that. I process it on the iPhone. Snapseed's a great app for black and white conversions. There are a few others as well. But Snapseed is kind of the Lightroom of the iPhone. And yeah, you know, what started to happen that's been, from a business point of view, exciting for me is that I've started to license and sell a reasonable number of iPhone images. That's really a pretty recent development for me. And you know, I could even vaguely imagine someday just traveling with an iPhone. Maybe. This is an iPhone shot through the rainy window of a bus in Rabat, Morocco. The thing is that, I mean, as many of you know, photography is a craft of trade-offs. Whatever you do, if you gain one thing, you probably have given up something else. And honestly, you can take some shots with an iPhone that you cannot take with a big boy camera. My walk-around camera is a Nikon D810, okay? And it's a great camera, very versatile, 36 megapixel capture, and I can blow it up big, which is part of what I do for a living, so that's a good thing. But in truth, I can get in places with an iPhone that I can't with it. I can have people who aren't worried about me when I use it, which is a good thing. And also, A small sensor size means it has a lot of depth of field from a technical point of view. That's one of the pieces of the equation there. So the iPhone as a camera actually has a level of depth of field that is not possible with a full frame camera. This is also an iPhone shot. And this is a sort of abstract of clouds and the Columbia River via the camera I always have with me, my iPhone. Now, this is an image I shot on a beach in California with a big camera. It may look a little bit like Chinese mountains in a landscape, but if you see the footprints up here and the wave here, you'll see it's something else. So part of training oneself to become a good photographer is learning how to look at things and see what things look like in different guises. This is a moonrise where I actually did an in-camera exposure sequence and timed it so that it would overlap like that. The lines you see here are the Golden Gate Bridge. One thing that's interesting with black and white is the idea of inverting it. So back in the old days, you had an obvious inversion. You had a film negative and a print positive. Well, you can pretty much do the same thing here. Okay, there's a single move in LAB color that goes from positive to negative and back again when you invert the L channel. It flips white for black and black for white. Again, regular, this is the way it was shot around this succulent with a piece of black velvet around it, and this is the inversion. This waterfall in the Columbia Gorge almost looked to me like it had people screaming in it. I've noted as I started this presentation that black and white is not really black and white. It really ought to be a color file, and as a color file it might be sepia, might be brown, might be some other color. In the chemical darkroom, some of this was done via tinting. You can also, if you want to create an antique look, put it on a sort of frame like this Tuscan Road here. And again, this is really a brown image, a sepia tint, which, you know, in Lightroom or Photoshop, you can click sepia tint and bingo, it gets sepia. In what sense is this black and white? Well, it's monochromatic, it's one color. And this Sierra Mountain shot as well. This is a split-toned image. So what I did here, it's rooftops of Paris, and what I did here was I toned the roofs using a different tint, basically, than I did the rest of the image. So it's a split-toned image. And the point of this very sepia image is my poor little circumflex key here looks so alone. So, you know, the truth is that all photo images are some kind of narrative. There might be stories, they might be poems. If there isn't something to identify with in an image you create, then you've got some degree of problems. HDR has high dynamic range imaging, is a technique where you take multiple images and combine them to create greater dynamic range than you get out of a single image. It has a bit of a bad rap because people have used HDR to create color images that can be over the top grotesque. The good news when you do it in black and white is that's not a problem because there's no color to become grotesque. And the thing that is not universally understood about HDR is that besides creating a greater dynamic range, you also have more information when you combine the captures. So you can get images that are actually sharper than a single image in the correct circumstance and the correct techniques when you use monochromatic HDR. It's a pretty good example of that, really. This is a antique rebuilt motorcycle, a one-of-a-kind kind of thing, and the sort of gleaming metallic look that comes from monochromatic HDR is something that really can only be got that way. And another monochromatic HDR image of sunrise under this dragon in the Anza Borrega Desert. The thing is that if you think about where I was standing with this camera, with my camera, this side of the image would have been totally in shadow, right? So the only way you could get this image is through multiple different bracketed exposures. Nothing else is possible. And as promised, here's my road less traveled again. Here's the way the raw color file looked in Adobe Camera Raw, with some minor adjustments, but that's basically the idea of what was in my camera. Here's the way I processed it in color. It's a pretty nice image in color. It's a little over the top, and I on purpose put more color in the eucalyptus trees here than they deserved. And here's the layer stack in Photoshop that converted this image to monochromatic. There are a couple of things to look at here, and one is that this is a lot of layers, 10 layers. The other is that you use layers and masking, and you can pinpoint control each part of an image. You see I have the color at the bottom of the stack, and the stack goes up. As it goes up, each one up at the top has less opacity than down below. So a layer stack in Photoshop should be sort of looked at like a stack of pancakes you're about to eat. If you look down on the pancakes from the top, there's a pat of butter that may be melting, and all you see is the top pancake. But if you reduce the opacity of that top one, then what's below it comes through. So my top layer here is at 14% opacity, whereas if you go down here, you've got a black and white layer that's at 100% to prevent any of the color from the original image leaching through. Now, and here's some more examples of this kind of conversion. Churches are great places for shadows. And this is one of the slot canyons near Page, Arizona, with a piece of tumbleweed in the front, and the tumbleweed was lit like this so that I could create this composition around it. A tree and its reflection in the Imperial Gardens in Nara, Japan. And some spires in Prague from the top. One of the things I found, Prague is a great place to go to photograph. I recommend it. There are more things to photograph there than you can imagine. In fact, with my book, the Photographer's Black and White Handbook, what I've done there, it's a technique book, but it's also to some extent a travel book, because each of the chapters is about doing this technique and using it in a particular place, and one of the chapters is based around Prague. But with this image, the tower that I'd gone up would not allow me to carry my tripod. So how do I do HDR? Well, you put it on burst mode, you put it on auto bracket, and you align it after the fact. It's not quite as good as shooting it on a tripod, but it works. It's good enough. This is the Pont Valentre near Cahors in southwestern France. Process to look old. What is old is new again. With this fun house, the most difficult aspect of making the image was getting me out of the photo. And I'm right there. I tried, but I didn't quite succeed. Yeah, I could have taken me out in Photoshop, but I decided to leave a little me in there, like the Hitchcock effect. This is under the municipal pier in Berkeley, California. That pier, by the way, in recent years has been closed because it's unsafe. The interesting thing about climbing down under it is you get to share it with crabs and rats and various other nice creatures, and it's only accessible at very low tide. But nice to photograph this with the 135 Zeiss telephoto to get some sharpness and perspective at the end. You know, I love to photograph on stormy days. Ansel Adams said, if you don't go out in bad weather, you never get to photograph the clearing storm, and that's very true. And in black and white, you also don't have to worry so much. Okay, it's gray, that's great, nice light. So we're thinking about. With this image of the pyramid in the court of the Louvre in Paris, it was in one of my previous books. And when the book was translated in Europe, in the German translation, the publisher wrote me or emailed me or something and said, you know, we can't use that image. You don't have a permission from the Louvre, do you? So I said, no, I don't have any permission. And they said, well, here in Europe, our copyright laws are different. The Louvre owns the copyright to this thing. We can't publish it without a license. So can you substitute an image, please? So that's a story more about the vagaries of international licensing than black and white photography, but there you go. The moral I would draw here is that this is really a much more interesting subject at night, provided you avoid the people who keep trying to kick you out of there, than it is during the day. And I have, one of the experiences of people who do what I do is that I have been ejected from many, many places. It's a occupational, I wouldn't say hazard, but it happens. This is a view on the Kimono-Kodo pilgrimage trail in the Kii Mountains in Japan that's called a view of 10,000 peaks. And obviously, they're not quite 10,000. That's poetic exaggeration. I was climbing. I was walking along the trail. I did a long foot walk there in the rain. When I got to Japan, I bought a big umbrella. I had my umbrella and my tripod, my back, my camera bag. And when I got to the top of the pass where I could look at this view, the rain broke for just a little bit, and I was able to shoot a multi-piece panorama. And there's me, and I think that's it for this presentation.
Thank you very much. You were very